So today's meeting, we have Paul, Mansfield, Katie House and Richard Spencer in that order. So Paul, are you ready?
I believe I am. I'm going to attempt to share my screen.
Right, so we can see that.
Okay, slideshow.
Start it. Yep.
We're there, are we?
That's it. We're there.
Excellent. Okay, so this one's called Performers with a capital P. It's about differences and similarities between traditional singing and popular music performance. So, hello from the East Midlands of England, as I usually say, to locate myself. You can easily distinguish between traditional folk music and popular music by just talking about the economic relationships concerned. But I'm really looking at the detail of singing performance today. And having said that, I'm not going to talk about every conceivable angle on that. I'm going to look at three. I'm going to look at performer persona. I'm going to look at the concept of egoless performance. And I'm going to look at the question of influences from popular to folk over time. Now, this overlaps with a number of things we've looked at on TSF before. So, for example, David Atkinson and Bruce Lindsay, conveniently both on the same YouTube recording, if you want to track it back to April 2021, on persona in David's case and Sam Larner at the Repertoire in Bruce Lindsay's case. And it also overlaps a bit with Sue Allen's chapter in the Ballad Partners Old Songs, New Discoveries book. I'm hoping this won't just be a remix. I'm hoping there will be some new ideas in this, but it's only really for the idea of prompting thought and discussion. There's no definitive findings or anything like that in here at all. So one of the things that got me thinking about this in the first place was the differences between individual traditional singers and Sam Larner in particular. So Christopher Hepper in a CD review in Folk Music Journal a few years back talked about Sam being a showman in his singing, using his hands, interrupting a verse, laughing and joking. And he contrasted this with two other East Anglian singers, Harry Cox and Walter Pardon, and referred to them staring into the distance when they were singing. So that was one of the things that got me interested in this. The other, I guess, was the concept of the more extreme popular music performers and how distant that seemed to be from folk music. So three examples which I think do exemplify the extreme: David Bowie, Bob Dylan and Lana Del Rey, all of them not their real names. And these were people who, or still are in two cases, of course, known for adopting different personae in their music, having different personae at different stages of their career, and in their very different ways, using quite a lot of artifice. Now, this seems incredibly distant from the world of traditional folk music. But then it occurred to me that we heard from Vic Gammon a couple of months ago about the traditional musician with the rather implausible age and backstory. And I thought to myself, okay, well, that's interesting because that's an example of something akin to the self-mythologizing that goes on in pop music. And I also think it's reasonably plausible to suggest that some traditional singers confronted with a maybe rather credulous song collector might have embroidered their autobiography. So even at this apparent kind of extreme of artifice, there might be some kind of overlap. However, when you look at the basics of persona, I think there's quite a lot of overlap anyway, because whether you're a pop singer or a folk singer or a traditional singer, you usually have a role in a song, whether that's of the narrator or one or the other characters in the song. And of course, that might change from verse to verse. So that's just inherent in the nature of the song, I think. And there's also an assumption that the performer's persona is distinct from the real offstage individual. And I think in different ways this applies across the popular field and the traditional field. We don't assume that somebody is Lord Bateman or Franklin or the young girl cut down in their prime just because they're singing about that. Where I think popular music drifted off on a different track was perhaps in the 1960s, referencing the dreaded A word, authenticity, where the singer-songwriter type came in, and there was an assumption that there was some kind of personal experience behind the songs. And of course, that does exist in popular music still, that some songs are interpreted as having an autobiographical element. The other thing where I think there is a similarity is that when you're singing, you usually have the same kind of persona, the same kind of presentation as a performer from song to song and from performance event to performance event. Again, that might vary by individual, but I think, again, it's something that, albeit in different ways, goes across folk music and popular music. So I won't say anything more about that because David Atkinson's spoken about this before, and there's a lot of stuff about persona out there. So I decided to do something different, and I thought, what do I associate with traditional singing? And I thought, well, I associate traditional singing with a kind of lack of ego and a less than demonstrative kind of style. So I did what modern people apparently do nowadays, and I asked artificial intelligence about it. So I posed the question, is there such a thing, or is it true that traditional folk music is characterized by an ego-free style characterized by humility? And this is the answer I got back, starting with the dreaded A word again. The folk songs thrive on authenticity, okay? Unfiltered by artifice, tends to exhibit humility rather than the ego. The focus is on the song itself. Singers let the narrative flow through them. The ego takes a back seat. Now, knowing the way this kind of program works, or at least what it flashed up before me, I knew that this was garnering stuff from various reference books. Encyclopedia Britannica was one of them, for example. So I think what the AI program has done here is it's kind of given us the stereotype, the kind of view outside of more specialist sort of literature that might be around about folk singing. So of course this now begs the question, is this stuff actually true? And I decided to investigate that by looking at the question of the different dimensions of performance. And I got a book by a guy called Marvin Carson. And like a lot of things to do with performance, it comes from theatre studies. Dance studies is also well represented in the performance literature. And what Carlson did at the beginning of his book is he listed a number of different definitions of performance. And two that stuck out for me in this context were performance as displaying skill and performance as a kind of standard. And I thought, yeah, that makes a degree of sense. So from this, I hypothesized that most singers, however amateur or traditional they are, have some kind of idea about the standard they want to achieve, the quality in their own performance. They know when they've sung well or when they have not, unless they've got a complete lack of insight, I suppose. So from that point of view, if that hypothesis is true, and I guess it's quite difficult to investigate, if that hypothesis is true, it's another area where there is not that kind of brick wall between popular music and folk music. There is not this lack of ego in folk music. What folk singers, traditional singers, are doing is they are taking a considered approach to their performance. It might not be artifice, but it could be artfulness. And I've certainly come across accounts of traditional singers doing things like being very careful about where they stand in the room so that they sound good and that sort of thing. Whether those kind of examples are enough to prove that egoless performance is a myth. I don't know. That's kind of up to you to decide. Okay, so context is important in this, and going back to the example of Sam Larner and Bruce Lindsay's talk, Nights at the Rechabite, clearly what Bruce was telling us was that Sam Larner was at times performing in a concert-style format to quite large audiences. Now, if you're doing that, you've got to project yourself in a particular way. You become a performer with a capital P, if you like. And what I'm wondering is, because I'm not sure how you would prove this, what I'm wondering is whether the kind of more demonstrative extrovert performance that Sam Larner would have had to do at the Rechabite Hall. I mean, he might have been more extrovert in the first place to take that on, but did that sort of performance then feed in some way to the way he sang in the pub or on board ship if he sang on board? I don't know. There may be people out there who know a lot about Sam Larner who can tell me something about that. But I do think that context, the kind of performance style specific to the Rechabite context, might have had some effect on his singing in other contexts. Now, it's perfect today that perfect coincidence that Katie Howson's on next, because I am going to make my statutory reference to the ship at Blackshall. Now, the ship at Blackshall is a kind of semi-informal. Now, if you've watched the film from the 1950s, as Katie suggested that you should do prior to her talk, you'll notice some ways in which the evening was structured. And you'll also perhaps remember the example of this character who you can see on one edge of the photo there. I think that's him anyway, Wickets Richardson. And in the film, he performs his song about the cobbler, and he acts out making a shoe as part of that song. So again, that is a kind of performance with a capital P. And what I would suggest, and here I'm drawing on Jeanette Dunn's work on the ship in a later era, is even the singers who appear to be quite spontaneous, very undemonstrative, did have this idea of I am a singer and I deserve to be listened to. There are some issues about respect involved in their performance in that community, and possibly ideas around their own status as well. So again, I think this is something which rather acts against the idea that traditional folk music is this completely separate thing that has this kind of egoless quality and no consideration on the singer's parts about how they sing. Right, I've just got two more things to cover, which I hope is going to leave us a fair bit of time for discussion, as this is supposed to be a discussion paper. So I was reading an older article by a Scandinavian writer called Ingrid Åkesson, some of whose material overlaps with material in Sue Allen's book chapter, about the influences from other musical genres. So the idea here is that as traditional song becomes more detached from its original community setting, and it becomes, in a sense, distant in time, perhaps distant in geography, inevitably there are influences that come in from other types of music. Now, the example I had in mind, and it's one that Sue referred to, is Joseph Taylor, the North Lincolnshire singer who was recorded by Percy Grainger. Now, we know that Joseph Taylor spent several decades singing in the church choir. And on top of that, I came across a reminiscence either from his granddaughter or great-granddaughter, I can't remember which, on the internet, talking about how he would walk considerable distances to listen to singers at a concert. He'd walk 20 miles each way to go to a concert. And these, I guess, would have been mixed concert repertoires, which would have had folk songs, music hall, light opera, perhaps religious and patriotic numbers, that kind of thing. And again, you wonder, and again, difficult to prove, but you wonder whether listening to these other kinds of music affects singing in the case of people like Joseph Taylor. One example I've come across in my own listening to field recordings, and I'm not going to pretend that it's anything other than a relatively small number of singers, is people who recorded in the 1950s and 1960s who, to my ears, because of their phrasing, suggest that to me that they're being influenced by singers like Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. There are also particular examples of this, or particular association with this style of singing, I think, with the London pub singer scene. And of course, you could hypothesize that when you're singing in a pub, there might be reasons other than Frank Sinatra about why your phrasing is a bit different. I'm sure you see what I'm getting at there. So lastly then, and referring again to Ingrid Åkesson's article, she talks about the other effect of this distancing in time and geography and culture from the original source communities of the song, having the semi-paradoxical effect of people trying really hard to define what traditional song sounds like, what it should sound like. And I suppose this is predictable, really, because if you've got no definitions, you've got no boundaries, then what is traditional music? What is folk music? So from that point of view, we shouldn't be surprised by this. But of course, this can bring in its own distortions. You think about the different kinds of ways in different eras, likes of Cecil Sharp, Ewan MacColl, different people trying to work out definitions of prescriptive, this is how it should be done. You could say they're imposing those definitions and their views on a pre-existing reality. And not only that, but there also starts to be this peculiar thing that the source singers feed into folk revivals, and then the folk revivals feed back into subsequent source singing. So, for example, in the English context, you might get artists of the younger generation from the 60s and 70s onwards up to today, thinking, well, the original and definitive way of singing the song is the way Martin Carthy sings it. Whereas Martin Carthy, as a revival singer, might have been listening to Sam Larner and a lot of other source singers. So you get this kind of effect where everything's one or two steps on from where we started. And I guess again, how this fits with whether there is or is not a brick wall between pop music and folk music is it's another example of how the traditional type is not actually static. It's not a kind of pure form because it's affected by subsequent attempts to make it fit a particular definition and a view of how things should be done. So again, to encourage discussion, I'm not going to say any more at this point. I'm going to leave you with some further references, and hopefully these and the other things I listed at the beginning will be in the notes at some point, either this afternoon or at a later date. But from me, that's it. And over to you to see whether that sparked any particular ideas.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. That was very, very interesting. Unshare your screen, you may.
Yep, I've just probably done the wrong thing there. Am I still there? You still hear me?
Yeah, still hear you, but we can still see your screen. So you need to unshare.
Yeah, okay. I just seem to have disappeared.
Well, I just lost it.
Where have I gone? I can't see myself anymore.
Somebody mute Conrad.
How's that?
That's excellent. Thank you. Well done.
I'm muted.
We do have time for questions. If anybody's got some, Conrad, could you mute yourself for a moment, please?
I'm trying to find out where the raise hand.
Okay, well, if anybody wants to raise their hand, they go down to reactions as usual. Click on the raise hand button. Meanwhile, Paul, I mean, often, most of the time when we're talking about the history of folk song and stuff, we're talking about the songs. That's a lot easier than talking about style, because I'm not sure, I'm a bit worried that we don't know enough about how the style was before recorded sound took over. And recorded sound always upsets the context, doesn't it? The situation, and even more so when you've got a film crew in the pub and so on. So that's one of the things that worry me, is that the sort of how evidence comes from the later period when all our singers have heard Bing Crosby or the Beatles or whoever. Anyway, Joan has her hand up first. So Joan, unmute.
Yeah, okay. One of my favorite singers, based on listening to her on Tobar on Dual Case, which I'm probably mispronouncing, the Scottish traditional website, is Bessie White, and basically one of the reasons she's one of my favorite singers is that she can't remember more than a couple verses of any song, which is kind of like me. But the other thing is that she has a very sweet, sort of almost soft voice, which is not how you think of Scottish traditional singers. But there are a couple occasions where was recorded at a some kind of performance instance where they had to have given her a microphone. So technically, with a microphone, you don't need to sing louder. But nevertheless, she seems in those instances to be more stentorian, like she's trying to sing to the crowd, even though she doesn't need to sing louder. She's got the help of a microphone, and I'm wondering, you know, sometimes the existence of an audience full of people and you're trying to reach all of them might have you adopt a different style of singing than you would if you were in a small room. And it certainly seemed to be the case in Bessie White's case. By the way, if you're looking her up, it's spelled Betsy, but everyone calls her Bessie, so that's what I'm calling her.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the issue of context is really, really important here, because one of the things that I've not considered is the issue of singing in a domestic environment or in a workplace, for example, servant girls in a manor house or a farmhouse or something like this, and of course, work songs as a specific genre. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, because it does emphasize the importance of context and indeed the importance of microphones, because music like Bing Crosby's would not have existed without a certain advance in microphone technology. Otherwise, you'd been bellowing down one of those big horn-shaped things,
Yeah, thank you. Vic's got his hand up. Vic and Sheila.
Right. It's actually Sheila's going to say.
Sheila?
Hello.
Hi.
It just reminded me of about 50 years or so ago, Martin Carthy, it could have been at Cambridge Folk, I can't remember where it was or who was singing, but Martin was there, and some singer. Sorry?
Keep going, Sheila.
Some singer was singing, and Walter Pardon was in and he got up and strode out. Martin went after him saying, "Walter, what's the matter? Are you all right?" And he said, "Oh, silly," waving his hands about. It's, and Walter Pardon had been taught to sing with his hands at his side and not to move, and that's how you ought to do it.
Right.
I'd throw that in.
Yeah, sounds a bit like Irish dancing, doesn't it? No, can't move your top half.
Thank you, Sheila. John Baxter.
Yeah, I was just, my thought was that a lot of the quotations that you gave were assuming that songs have emerged from a community context, rather than many of the songs were written for the stage or whatever and were adopted by the community. And I wonder, well, it would be suggesting that it might be possible to find songs with an origin in the 19th century, say, and trace them through how they were sung and whether that influenced how people sang them in a community context, there would be an awful lot of holes in it. But I suspect that we don't know enough, and it would be useful to look at it on the basis of individual songs, tracing them through from point of origin. The songs that were written for stage were generally written for performance in character, where, unlike pop stars today, popular singers would adopt a different character and dress up differently for each song. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I mean, it made me think about the Copper family, actually, because I think I'm right in saying that a fair chunk of the Copper family's repertoire is traceable back to pleasure garden type presentations. And I suppose one of the hypotheses, and again, like a lot of the material in my talk, it's kind of difficult to work out how you'd investigate it. But one of the theories could be that if a song's written for the stage, there was something in the construction of the song, whether it was the lyric or the tune, that meant that it would only work effectively if it was projected out in a particular way, as opposed to sung very softly. But then that's another unprovable hypothesis, maybe.
Yeah, I think we could, we've got to remind ourselves that there were action songs, as it were, where people did put on a performance, and there were dialogues and duets and little dance things. All the collectors mention these kinds of things. So when we're talking about traditional song, we've got to be careful. We're not just talking about Lord Bateman or Child or Laws type things. There was all sorts of stuff in there. And I think
Yes.
at a previous meeting, I tried to pin down Fagin the Cobbler, the one that you mentioned from the film, because that's always puzzled me. Why would he sit there and do the actions? And there are other versions. Other people have done the same. Even we showed at one of our meetings a bit of film from Kentucky or Tennessee or somebody doing the same thing. Now, my hunch, and I can't prove it, is that comes from a stage show, a pantomime, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, I think it is, from the mid-19th century, which had the actions. And of course, it all makes sense if it's a pantomime and he's in, as John says, in character. But for somehow or other, that one has lasted in the tradition for 100 or so years. I'm not sure what I'm getting at here, except to underline what John has just said, really, is that where the song comes from may affect the way that it's performed, even
Sure.
100 years later.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Anybody, any more questions?
Steve, I can't raise my hand. I don't appear to be able to do that as the host.
Okay, just wait.
May I just make a point? Ready from Baring Gould, an occasion he describes when he collected in South Seal, and he was going to collect in the local pub from a group of men. But word got out that he was going to do this, and a large audience turned up beforehand. And the group of men, about 5 of them, all rose to the occasion and gave a fine performance of singing for the benefit of the audience, but not at all what Baring Gould wanted, and the songs were different. But the next day he had them in individually, and it was a quite different type of occasion, with them singing the songs that he wanted to hear, or the type of songs he wanted to hear, what we'd think of as folk songs, I guess, in a totally different manner. So, good example of different occasion requiring a different type of performance.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I think we better leave it there. And thank you, Paul, for keeping to time, as well as giving us something to think about. As always, these will be on YouTube, all being well, so you can revisit the questions that Paul has posed for us. So we now move on to well, we stay actually in East Anglia with Katie. Are you there, Katie?
Yes, I am
Yes, you am. Good.
in East Anglia.
Where else?
Cool. Right, okay, I'm going to share my screen. We might have a small technical moment in the middle. Hopefully it won't be a hitch.
Right, so we have your screen.
Yeah, I can't actually get, oh, there we go. That look like what you want to see?
That's good. Singing Pubs of Suffolk.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. At the last in-person TSF meeting, A Feast in the East in April, Steve Roud said to me, "I'm always amazed by how much you know about the pubs of Suffolk." So I thought I'd try and summarise some of that today. It occurred to me actually it's a little bit like All Aboard the Charabanc, but not quite so much fun. But you already know, you've heard from Paul about Blacksall Ship, and I hope you've been able to see that film. I'm sure the link will go out again if you didn't get to see it. Or if you, most people here will have seen it before, I'm sure. But that's the way most people know about the tradition in Blacksall Ship, is through Peter Kennedy's recordings and his iconic film, Here's a Health to the Barley Mow. My late husband John and I came to Suffolk in 1978, and we were drawn here by the musical tradition, but we quickly realised how far the ship was from us. It's nearly 40 miles away, and so we determined to look at the pubs and villages closer to home in mid-Suffolk to see what we could find. And today is going to be looking at Blacksall and that area, and mid-Suffolk where we worked, and also West Suffolk. So Suffolk is quite a big county. And we're in the east of England, as you can see. If you're not familiar with Suffolk, a lot of people in England aren't familiar with Suffolk. There's actually an extraordinary amount of evidence for pub music and singing in Suffolk, but of course people also noted down and recorded songs in people's homes. Please bear this in mind when looking at the rest of the maps, which only show locations with musical pubs. In my opinion, the most meaningful contributions were those made over extended periods of time by three collectors, all of whom had a great interest in pub culture and entertainment, rather than seeing themselves as academics or collectors, and that's Keith Summers, Neil Lanham and John Howson, the last two being long-term residents of the county. So in this slide, I've tried to map all the pubs I've identified which had music and or singing sessions, and you'll see that Blacksall was very far from being the only place. I'm quite sure I've missed some sources and some pubs, but this survey is based on documentary or oral evidence for singing and music making up to about 1980. No one has ever attempted a complete sweep of the entire county, so the evidence is always somewhat random and patchy. Now, it's very noticeable that the vast majority of the singers that I'm going to talk about and that were collected were men. I am looking at pub culture here, and pubs were largely a masculine domain up to the 1950s at least, although when there was a musician, usually a lone melodeon player, who could knock out some tunes for dancing, this then provided a context in which women could take part more freely. As one interviewee said, "My dad used to take my mum in for a glass of stout, and then they'd get to polkaing." In pubs which were mostly singing, the opportunities for women to contribute were more restricted by social conventions, although a few women from pub-keeping families did participate. Suffolk is usually divided for administrative purposes into East, Mid and West Suffolk, and I shall follow that convention today, beginning in East Suffolk, the coast and its hinterland. So if you're not familiar with it, over to the right on this map, that is the North Sea. I've counted at least 43 pubs in this area where singing is known to have taken place, and clearly there isn't time to tell you about them all, so I'm going to give you some brief details about a few of the more interesting ones marked on this map. And it's inevitable that we've got to start, of course, with the Blacksall Ship. So many recordings have been made there, books and theses have been written about it, and it's been included actually in several films. Peter Kennedy's 1955 monograph, Here's a Health to the Barley Mow, portrayed the rather raucous atmosphere in the pub very well, and it stands as a rare audiovisual capture of what was actually a fairly common phenomenon of popular culture. Almost as well known is the Eel's Foot Inn in Eastbridge. In the 1930s, the nearby town of Leiston was known as Suffolk's Little Moscow, and one of the local radical intellectuals told Bert Lloyd about the singing here. The pub then went on to achieve a degree of fame, featuring first in BBC radio programme Saturday Night at the Eel's Foot in 1939, and then again through Lloyd's contacts in a double-page spread in a Christmas issue of the Picture Post magazine in 1914. You can see some images from there on the slide. You will notice that one of the pictures does show a young woman singing. This was Ethel Morling. She was a daughter-in-law of Lily Morling, the landlady, and she was aged just 27 at the time. But unfortunately, despite the quite a few recordings from there, we don't know what Ethel sang. Moving beyond these two iconic pubs, we'll now look at the rest of the coastal strip to see which other pubs had similar musical gatherings, and we'll start in the north with the Kessingland Sailors' Home. Some years ago, a friend gave me a booklet of reminiscences called Give Time, Songs and Tales of a Longshoreman, and in it were indeed songs and a unique insight into community entertainment in this pub in the 1930s. Kessingland is just south of the fishing port of Lowestoft, where the herring fishing once defined the town and the nearby villages. The unknown author of this self-published booklet actually transcribed the words to all these songs, which made them somewhat easier to identify than the singers with all those nicknames. One of the songs listed here, Jolly Jack, Roud 1785, is a song seemingly only collected on the east coast of Suffolk, and the writer himself sang it when the BBC recorded a radio programme called Down to the Sea at Cliff House, Sizewell in May 1957. Sometime I'll get back to the BBC written archives and have a look at that. We now move on to the attractive seaside town of Southwold, where there's much documentation for singing from the 1870s onwards, although not very much in the notebooks of the early folk song collectors. We'll take a quick look at two pubs, the first in the centre of the town, the Southwold Arms. From 1869 to 1897, it was run by Robert Mac Mackenzie, pictured here, who hosted many congenial events for locals and visitors alike. The well-to-do visitors who stayed at the pub became known as Mackenzie's Lambs. At the end of their holidays, the Lambs used to arrange a sing-song, at which residents in the town were invited to sing for the prize of a leg of mutton. This entertainment took place outside the pub, drawing such large crowds that the traffic had to be diverted. The house was illuminated with Chinese lanterns, and the singers stood under a table. They might have ended up under the table. They stood on a table under the pub sign, with the leg of mutton dangling above their heads. And many of the local fishermen would compete for the prize, and some of their songs were said to be very long, making the whole thing a rather lengthy affair. And that pub certainly had singing going on 100 years after that, into the 1970s, when I was doing some collecting around there. People told us about the singing in there. In 1910, Ralph Vaughan Williams and George Butterworth visited Southwold, and they noted down songs from several singers, including three brothers who were all fishermen. Their notes don't mention any pubs, and on their fleeting visit, they unfortunately missed a singer in the centre of this next sketch. This 1930 drawing by J.W. George is captioned The Harbour Inn in 1911, and it features singer Billy Rogers, apparently in full flow. Rogers was a blind basket maker who lived in the centre of Southwold and who was known to sing in other pubs in the town too. As you can see, the Harbour Inn is quite isolated there on the river, about a mile out of town. In late 1947, E.J. Moran was scouting for singing pubs to feature in outside broadcasts for the BBC radio programmes when he remarked, "I visited a hostelry near Southwold and I found it crowded with fishermen, one after another in full song. About one song in five was a folk song, and the wretched fellow at the piano would insist on trying to accompany the singer. Being totally without any modal feeling in his bones, he not only put the singers off their stroke, but forced them to alter their tune to suit his abominable machinations. Although Moran didn't name the pub, I'm pretty certain it was the Harbour Inn, where the piano player was Stanley Tinny Townsend, also known for his singing of the Vicar and the Curate. The piano accompaniment didn't seem to be so much of an issue for author and broadcaster John Seymour, however, who took a more relaxed view of the tradition and remarked in his 1956 book, Sailing Through England, "That harbour entrance is their trouble. Whenever the wind blows on shore, or even along the shore, it is hazardous for them to go in or out. If they go out in the morning, they're never quite sure they'll be able to get in again at night. And consequently, they spend a great deal of their time sitting about in the Harbour Inn, looking extremely picturesque, giving yachtsmen and others sound advice, singing extremely good songs extremely well, and having their photographs taken by art photographers from Waldringfield." Reading that aloud, it sounds slightly patronising, but I think it's actually Seymour's wryly affectionate humour for men that he actually understood very well. Singer John Dusso Winter described singing sessions in the harbour into the 1960s and 70s, and today is still going strong with a regular folk music session attracting visiting musicians and singers, as well as a large core of local people. Moving south, we find several pubs not far from Blacksall Ship, which were popular with more or less the same crowd of singers. The Butley Oyster has 2 adjoining rooms, which was a source of discontent amongst singers in the late 1970s when the pub was popular with local folkies, and there is a possibly apocryphal, although I think it is true, story about traditional singer Percy Ling being asked to stop singing as he was disturbing the folk club in the other room. Neil Lanham recorded Bob Hart, Jumbo Brightwell, Percy Webb and other singers here in 1967, and around the same date he also recorded the same 3 singers in the Snape Crown. Neil wrote that the pub is the very axis of the continuation of local tradition as the meeting place of the community, but he felt that the pubs were being changed by an influx of people from outside dominating the music, and he quoted another musician who described the Snape Crown in the late 20th century as a café for the nouveau arrivé and passing hoi polloi. The 400-year-old pub has a superb double settle around the fireplace, making it very congenial for a small number of people and also very photogenic, as you can see here. We're going to hear a snippet of a song now, recorded, I'm not sure, it wasn't recorded in there, sorry, but it's from Percy Webb, who certainly sang this in the pub. Percy's a good singer, not often heard of these days, and he's going to sing Flash Company, which was a kind of totemic song in East and Central Suffolk, and I'm just going to give you a verse of it.
Once I loved a young girl as I love my life, but keeping Flash company was the ruin of my life. Keeping Flash company like a great many more. If it hadn't been for Flash company, I should never be so poor. So take the yellow handkerchief in remembrance of me. Wear it round your neck, love, in Flash company. Flash company, my boys, like a great many more. If it hadn't been for Flash company, I should never been so poor.
So actually, I'm reflecting on all the things that Paul said earlier as I'm doing this talk. There's a lot of relevant things to think about. And you could probably hear that recording was made in a pub, but in fact it was made in the King's Head in Islington, London in 1968, when Percy was on a rare trip to the Big Smoke. A little further south from Snape is the Orford Jolly Sailor, another pub with a long history of singing. In 2001, I met Fred Smythe, pictured here, who told us how his father, Harry, and other men of his generation used to sing in the Jolly Sailor and occasionally in other pubs in the village in the 1930s. Fred learned his first song, The Faithful Sailor Boy, from his father, and he too sang the song that we've just heard from Percy Webb, Flash Company. I would say really almost every singer from the East Coast, from the coast, sang that song. On the western edge of this coastal strip is the small market town of Framlingham. This is in an area well documented by Keith Summers, and in fact I think this may even be Keith himself on the left of this atmospheric photo taken by Mike Yates, which shows the tiny public bar of the Hare and Hounds. By the 1970s, when that photo was taken, the pub was always referred to by the name of the elderly landlord, Jimmy Finbow. When I went there in the late 1970s, it was like a time capsule. There were calendars from decades ago still on the walls and pickled eggs that would sink a battleship. Always a warm welcome for singers, though. We're going to move on to the next map, to the central belt of Suffolk, usually termed mid-Suffolk. Drawing up a map in this way is a bit false because many of the villages on the eastern edge of this map would look to Framlingham as their local town, which we've just visited in the last section. The eastern side of this area was well documented by Keith Summers in Sing, Say or Pay, but as we go west, we're firmly into the area that John looked at in the early 1980s for his survey, Many a Good Horseman. We'll start in the east, where perhaps the best known pubs were the Brundish Crown and the Dennington Bell, although to be honest it's hard to choose from the many pubs that still had singing and music into the 1970s. The Bell is actually a mile or so outside the village of Dennington, in the tiny hamlet of Owls Green. Melodeon player Dolly Curtis's family, the Kerrys, kept the pub in the early 20th century, and in the 1980s she was still welcomed like a family member. I remember Billy Cox, who played drums with Dolly sometimes, giving a heartfelt rendering of The Tears Have Washed I Love You from the blackboard of my heart. But a few years beforehand, another Billy, Billy List, was a regular in there, and in the late 1970s he was actually filmed in the Dennington Bell, standing up proudly in his traditional horseman's suit and singing a comic song. The Lists were a well-known musical family around the Framlingham area, living in a remote area called World's End, or Saxted Bottoms if you're local. Billy's father, Harry List, also sang, and he was recorded by Peter Kennedy in 1953, having been introduced by another singer, Alec Bloomfield, who was a cousin. And Billy's brother, Fred List, who's pictured at the top there, was also a singer, step dancer and melodeon player who took over from Fred Pierce in the Blacksall Ship as house musician. Billy List told Keith Summers that he'd picked up the song that we're about to hear, Paddy and the Rope, from Bob Scarce in the Blacksall Ship, going back on a number of occasions until he had the whole song. Keith remarked, "A few months later I heard Billy List sing Paddy and the Rope in Dennington Bell, after which he turned to me, winked and said, 'Got it in the end.'" Now, we're lucky enough now to be able to not only hear Billy List singing, but to see him as well, because there's a little bit of film coming up in a moment. And this clip is from a TV programme called Bygones, which often featured traditional music or singing as the end piece. This song that we're going to hear wouldn't be my first choice to share with you, but clips like this are so rare, there wasn't much choice, and I think it's worth it from the visual point of view. The song is a kind of extended joke displaying the stereotypical view of Irish labourers, which was common at the time in much popular culture. Sorry, I'm stumbling because now we're about to do a little transfer here, because I can't actually play this video from my presentation. So Martin's going to step in, hopefully, and show you the film. No.
Be hearing quite a bit about W.G. Grace. But before that, let's join some of the regulars of the Dennington Bell, which is a pub near Framlingham in Suffolk, to hear a recitation by William List, Paddy Stole the Rope.
There was once two Irish labouring men, to England they came over. They tramped about in search of work from Liverpool to Dover. Says Mick to Pat, "I'm tired of this, we're both left on alert. Now if we don't get work, be dead, we'll go and rob a church." So off they went with theft intent, the place they wanted finding. They got into a village church where nobody was minding. They scrapped together all they could and then prepared to slope. I said, Pat, hold on now, Mick, what shall we do for rope? We have no bag to hold our swag, or ere we were tied. Surely something stout and strong, the bundle must be tied. So then they spied the church bell ropes as swift as antelope. They scrambled to the belfry height to try and steal the rope. So holding on by a leg and hand, he took his clasp knife out. Then right above his head and hand, he cut that rope so stout. He quite forgot it held him up, so by the paws of soap, down to the bottom of the church fell Paddy in the rope. Mick bounded up the other rope, then like an apple thief, instead of cutting it above, he cut it underneath. The piece fell down and he left to hang up there and mope. Bad cess until the day, said he, when we came stealing rope. There was Paddy on the floor lay morning while Mick hung up an eye. Come down, says Pat. I can't, says Mick, but if I drop, I'll die. And I saw him brought the beadle round, the section and the police. Although they set poor Mickey free, the pair got no release. They took them to the station where the conduct now they rue. And if they had no work before, that plenty now to do. And with the ingenuity, they have a larger scope. And when they broke into the church and tried to steal the rope,
We're hearing quite a bit about W.G. Grace.
Hopefully we're back on track now. I believe that actually that the same kind of stories are told in Ireland, but with the butt of the jokes being men from Kerry, from County Kerry, and in Kerry they tell the same sort of stories about the men from North Kerry. And Jimmy McBride actually did record that in Donegal in Ireland. After Bill List died, that song was taken up by Tony Harvey, who also sang Caroline and the Young Sailor Bold, which he told me he'd learned from a lady called Mrs. Wright. And I've recently found out by the wonders of Facebook community groups that this was in fact Florence Wright, who was Billy List's common-law wife for 40 years, and who was known to step dance in pubs as well as sing. Good woman. We're going to continue a bit further west now. Great, it's working. To the Mendlesham Green Man. In Many a Good Horseman, John wrote in about 1984, I've no doubt that if I was to be taken back in time, say 35 years, to one pub in Suffolk with tape recorder in hand, of course, I would choose the Green Man. Our friend Levi Parker, who lived in our village but had lived in a caravan in Mendlesham Green for many years, recalled, old Pom Hart used to come in with a big red handkerchief round his neck, sit in the corner, and he'd be the one who would generally start singing. Henry Edward Pom Hart, who was born and lived all his life next door to the Green Man, was a singer that most people mentioned around there as knowing a lot of old songs, and he had comic songs in his repertoire too. Gordon Sorrett, pictured on the right here, was a prolific singer whom John recorded in 1983 to 84 when he was in his late 90s. And another singer and musician in the Green Man was Ted Thorpe, who died in 1963, but whose two daughters John interviewed. Gordon Sorrett recalled old Kruger, who sang John Barleycorn is an Indian Weed, and all these men lived very close to the pub. It doesn't seem to have attracted visitors in the same way that Blackthall Ship did. Mendlesham Green to this day retains a long-standing, slightly other sort of character with a large community of settled gypsies nearby. In the southern part of this central belt, when we looked at the map, musical pubs looked to be somewhat thinner on the ground, but this is an area that was just really less well covered by collectors. John did find at least 6 pubs in the town of Stowmarket which had music and singing at various times in the 20th century. In 1907, Ralph Vaughan Williams found a couple of singers in a pub in Hadley. Ipswich, the county town, seems to have scarcely been considered by folklorists, although in 1912 George Butterworth collected 3 songs from an unnamed singer, and in 1952 Peter Kennedy recorded George Bloomfield, Alec Bloomfield's father, who had moved to the town. Despite having a base in the town for 5 years from 1926 to 1931 when his parents lived in Ipswich, E.J. Moran doesn't seem to have collected anything locally except in a couple of villages nearby. Ipswich was a significant port town. In 1985, John recorded a number of songs from Harold Smythe, who was an ex-sailing barge master. The recordings were made in Harold's shed on the quayside, where you can see in the bottom left picture there, where he still helped with piloting vessels in and out of the docks right into his 90s. Harold mentions 3 pubs in Ipswich, the Tankard, the Beehive and the Spread Eagle, pictured here, as being good for singing. These were all in the same area of town, obviously Harold's stamping ground between the docks and the town centre, but there must have been many more around the town. Harold remembered his father, William Smye, who was born in 1869 and also a sailing barge master before him, singing this song, Scarborough in the Castle, which you'll know as perhaps as Stowbrow. Harold introduced this song to John, saying, now here's a local song, despite the fact, of course, that Scarborough is 200 miles north of Ipswich. However, this song is actually said to have roots in an old ballad about events at the Battle of Sole Bay, a sea battle which took place in 1672 off the Suffolk coast, so much closer to home.
It was Scarborough at the castle, where a fair young couple dwell. She dearly loved her sailor boy, and he loved her as well, for they were going to get married when dark deceived the eye, for instead of getting married, they had a watery grave.
He's a great singer, isn't he? Now we'll move on to look at the final section of the county, West Suffolk. Again, research, collecting and recording were rarer in this area for whatever reasons. John's defined area of collecting for many a good horseman included several villages along the A14 corridor, of which Elmswell, Woolpit and Rattleston were really quite busy places, each with more than one musical pub. The cluster of blue spots in the far south of this map are all down to Neil Lanham, who lived near the town of Haverhill for some years and met many singers in that area. He started recording in the 1950s, and some years later he founded his own recording label, the Helian's Bumpstead Gramophone Company, and published a couple of dozen albums from his earlier recordings. Unfortunately, they were on the notably unstable CDR format, and many of those no longer play, so if you've got them, treasure them. Several people mentioned the Thorpe Moreau Bull as a popular singing pub, where the dartboard would be taken down at 8:30 on a Saturday night, and then it was all over to entertainment. Sing, say, whistle or pay was the custom in this pub. Tom Smith on the right there and his father Bert Smith on the left were both regulars in there, and they both sang and played instruments as well. The sing, say or pay tradition meant that everyone could participate, even if it was only whistling in this case. It was the taking part which counted, not the quality of performance. Tom himself had a plain but tuneful voice, displaying his natural accent. We're lucky that back in the late 1950s, 2 folklorists, Des and Sheila Herring, were also making tape recordings in the west of the county of Suffolk, and some of the most atmospheric recordings that they made were in a pub in the picturesque village of Tostock in the Gardener's Arms, where all the old boys had their own songs. The Herrings' recordings were published by John, first on the Vintage Cassettes label, and later reissued on CD on the Veteran label. There were a number of singers known in the Gardener's Arms, including a fine selection of nicknames once again, Shucker Clark and Dobbin Birch, for example. Here's a recording made by Des and Sheila of Charlie Carver singing Sweet William in the bar of the pub in 1960, and that's Charlie Carver with the hat on to the left of that pole in that picture.
Run for Charlie. I saw a damsel in distress, oh, and up to me she came, saying, since you've had, then you will love me, pray tell to me your name. For 'tis some they call me Jack's pretty maid, and some they call me John, But when I'm come to the King's Highway, they call me Sweet William, oh, and they call me Sweet William. But when I'm come to the King's Highway, they call me Sweet William.
I always try and structure my talks finishing with a conclusion. However, the only conclusions I can draw at the moment, because this is really a survey, are that firstly, there were an awful lot of pubs where singing, music making and dancing took place in Suffolk, 131 in this survey in total. And secondly, that Mid Suffolk had as many, if not more, as I know I've missed some, than the better known coastal area. I've begun to put tentative dates on some of these because obviously it stretches over quite a long period of time, but it's all so dependent on the random evidence, mostly from oral sources, that it can only ever be a rather impressionistic view of what was going on. If one were to rely on sources such as newspaper reports to investigate the social history of pubs, this aspect would be almost completely hidden from view, with just the occasional obituary or court report indicating that such informal entertainment was taking place. We're fortunate in Suffolk to have more evidence from social and folk music historians, observers and commentators than many counties. That doesn't necessarily mean we had more singing. There are many people to thank in the preparation for this talk, but the most influential for me are these two brothers in arms. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Lovely.
That's wonderful. As always, as I always say, I know more about Suffolk pubs than I do about the ones down the road because of your talks. That was wonderful. I'm afraid we're running behind now, so we do not have time for questions or comments, even though most of your comments will be saying that was great. Thank you, Katie, and no doubt we'll hear more about Suffolk in at future meetings. But we're going to move on straight away to Richard, our last speaker for today, who's going to talk to us about Stumpy. Stumpy Bill.
That's me. Right, so if I share my screen, hopefully. That one. I think share. And that one. From the beginning. Is that right?
Yes, we do.
Good. Right, here we go then. I've been working for some time on a study of folk singers, song collectors and the Poor Law Union Workhouse, and in doing so came across a gentleman called William Colcombe, living in the early 1900s in Webley Workhouse in Herefordshire. William Colcombe, known by the nickname of Stumpy Bill, was a typical example of the sort of singers sought by song collectors in the first years of the 20th century. He was born about 1834 in King's Pyne and baptised in October of that year. According to the 1841 census, he was living in Hope under Dinmore with his mother, Susanna, and 5 siblings. His father, James, had died in 1840, and his mother died in 1841. Unsurprisingly, in the census of 1851, William is to be found in the workhouse at Webley, aged 13, with his 2 brothers, Alfred and Luke. Between 1861 and 1901, census records show William living in the workhouse or in various lodging houses around Webley. He died in the workhouse infirmary in 1909 of synectus cardiac failure. His grave is not marked. Ages given in all census records, particularly the early ones, are notoriously unreliable. In William's case, all the record dates are very variable. From the ages given on different census records and his death certificate, his birth date could have been anywhere between 1827 and 1838. It is quite possible he simply did not know how old he was. William was separated from his parents in childhood and from his brothers in his teens. He never married, so he was almost certainly childless. His must have been a very lonely life. This is exactly the footprint in history that you would expect to find for a Victorian working man or woman, as almost all had no voice of their own. However, William had a singing voice, which brought him to the attention of song collectors. William Colcombe met a surprising number of song collectors in the years between his discovery by Ella Leather in 1904 and his death in 1909. He gave them 20 songs in total, but this involved 39 different interactions with 6 different collectors. Most of his songs were noted at least twice by different people. Some were taken down 4 times. Ella Leather was a collaborative song collector, and like Sharp, Baring, Gould and others, got help in gathering either words or tunes. In Ella's case, her role was that of facilitator and word writer, as she did not trust her musical ability enough to note the tunes. Andrew King, in his 2010 article on Ella Leather, lists 16 people with whom she worked. The 6 collaborators who helped with Williams' songs were, in chronological order, Ella Leather, Annie Webb, Francis Jekyll, George Butterworth, Frank William, and Ralph Vaughan Williams. I don't have time for much biographical detail here, so I'll keep this section brief. Ella Leather was a gentleman farmer's daughter born 3 miles away from Webley in 1874. She married Frank Leather in 1893 and they set up home in Webley. She seems to have begun collecting folklore and folk songs about the same time in 1904. She presented several songs to the Folk Song Society using the help of Lucy Broadwood for subsequent publication, and she also accumulated the material for the 300-page book, The Folklore of Herefordshire, published in 1912. She died in 1928. All descriptions of her emphasise her humanity and her empathy. Lavender Jones notes that the workhouse was a favourite collecting ground for Mrs. Leather. She would visit the local one and sit at the piano in the matron's sitting room, to the annoyance of that worthy Mrs. Bumble, with the old people gathered round her, drawing music from them. This is probably an accurate description, although the matron, Mary Ann Dean, was certainly an acquaintance and probably a friend. Frank Leather was, among other things, clerk to the Board of Guardians, and the Deons were very progressive workhouse managers. Whoops, sorry. Annie Mary Webb was born in Bagshot in 1882, the daughter of a butcher. She was well educated and musically literate. Unfortunately, straitened finances meant she could not pursue further education as she wanted, and in the very early 1900s, she became governess to the Leathers' children. Her granddaughter told me she was a determined young woman and decided to support herself rather than rely on the family. She left the Leathers in about 1906, and by 1911, she was working as a governess in Surrey. In 1912, she married the love of her life and brought her family up in Cirencester. She died in 1978. Between 1904 and 06, she collected 16 songs with Ella Leather and is credited with 8 songs in the Journal of the Folk Song Society. Francis Jekyll was a well-connected and well-educated man who worked in the British Museum. He visited Webley in 1906 and was involved in collecting 11 songs, all from William Colcombe, some in collaboration with George Butterworth. Butterworth acknowledges his 6-year enthusiastic cooperation in his 1912 folk songs from Sussex, so the Webley visit marked the beginning of a long partnership. Frank Archer Gwilliam was born in 1872 in Clodagh, Herefordshire, and worked as a road surveyor. The 1911 census shows he was a single man and householder of a moderately large house on High Street, Webley. He noted 2 songs from William Colcombe in 1906. George Butterworth needs no introduction. He visited Webley in 1906 and collected 5 songs, all from William Colcombe, all in collaboration with Francis Jekyll. And Ralph Vaughan Williams, of whom, again, little needs to be said here. He visited Ella Leather at her invitation in 1908, and by the end of that year, she was sending phonograph cylinders for him to transcribe. He transcribed 5 songs of William Colcombe's, although it is not clear whether he met him in person. Before I look at what the song collector records can tell us about William Colcombe, I'll just quickly enumerate what the records are. The Folklore of Herefordshire is a magnificent book containing many examples of the county's folklore. It has a chapter on folk songs with 23 examples collected by Ella Leather and friends. William Colcombe collected 3 stories, 4 songs, and perhaps a cure for rupture. 12 Traditional Carols showcases some of the material collected in the Webley-Dilwyn area, amended and arranged to appeal to the musical middle class. The notes on the songs are minimal, and although the singers' names and locations are stated, there is no other information about them. William Colcombe is mentioned twice as the source of partial texts. Lavender Jones' Nest of Singing Birds is not part of the collector's records, but is based on some personal knowledge of Ella Leather, but all the information in this book about William Colcombe is gleaned directly from the folklore of Herefordshire. The collector's archives available at the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library website. These are the ones that contain information relating to William's songs. And there are also 5 articles in the Journal of the Folk Song Society which contain these songs. So one of the things the records contain is an excellent photograph of William taken by Ella Leather and preserved by Frank Sidgwick. According to the notes on the back of Sidgwick's copy, the picture was taken in April 1908 when he was 81, although he was almost certainly 74. The picture shows an elderly man, sans teeth, dressed in what are probably workhouse issues, clothes and hat. His nickname may indicate that he was rather short. His jacket has been rolled up at the sleeves. One of Ella's biographers stated that William had only one leg. The photograph shows that William had 2 articulated knees. In those days, most pauper amputees would have had to make do with a peg leg. He is also carrying a conventional walking stick rather than the crutch. Perhaps this tale is apocryphal, or possibly he had an amputation below his knee. His spectacles are probably workhouse issue as well. Joseph Rowntree insisted that glasses should be provided so that the inmates could read their Bible and presumably also perform their daily work. As the elderly William would have had no daily duties, this may mean he could read. Almost all the extra information the collectors left is contained in one paragraph in the preface to Ella Leather's book. Most enthusiastic of these was William Colcombe, who died a year ago in Webley Workhouse. He knew upwards of 30 traditional songs and carols and had a wonderful memory for old tales and riddles, many of which he'd learned in his youth from old Powell, the nail-maker, last of his trade in Webley, with whom he had lived for many years. Colcombe was the last man in Webley to work in a smock frock. He took a great interest in this collection and would greet me excitedly, sometimes with, "Got another bit for you, missus." Without wanting to pick this affectionate eulogy apart, I could say that the preface is dated 1912, while Colcombe died in 1909, that perhaps his reason for clinging to his smock frock was financial rather than sartorial, and that he probably knew many more than 30 songs if the word traditional is reinterpreted and his audience changed. His recorded repertoire is skewed to the traditional and the religious, traditional and acceptable. However, William's love for his material and his pleasure with sharing it with others comes across clearly. Apart from his songs and stories, "Got Another Bit for Ye" is probably his only recorded utterance. The Folk Songs Society's pamphlet Hints to Collectors lays down the Society's ground rules for data collection. It is most important that the collector should obtain all possible information from the singer as to the title and history of the song or tune, the manner in which it was learned, and the name, age and status, etc. of the person from whom it was learned. In all cases, the name, full address and occupation of the singer or performer, together with other interesting information obtainable, should be carefully noted. Unfortunately, in Colcombe's case, these requirements were neglected in almost every respect. One of the strange things about the collector's notes is it took them some time to discover Colcombe's first name. Most of the early records have his first name as Thomas, and only later does William become the standard. He was first identified as William by Annie Webb in August 1906. This has led some commentators to assume that there were 2 singers involved. Andrew King points out that the back of his photograph is inscribed W.T. Colcombe and guesses he may have used his 4 names interchangeably. But his baptism record, all the census records and his death certificate give his name as William alone. In 1910, the Journal of the Folk Song Society clarified the matter. The name of one singer, Mr. W. Colcombe, appears incorrectly as T. Colcombe in Journal Volume 2, Number 7. This statement seems to make it clear that Thomas was not an acceptable alternative. In only one case is William's age given. It was almost certainly incorrect. Against the Mountains High, Ella Leather records from W. Colcombe, age 77, in Webley Workhouse. But William, according to his baptism record, was only 72 at the time. It is entirely possible that this was William's mistake. This is also one of the few records which specifically place William in the workhouse. We know he was not an inmate in 1901, and we know that he died there in 1909, but between those dates, we have no idea where he lived. And that is all that can be gleaned from the collector's notes about William. Other interesting information was certainly known about him. Ella Leather in particular must have known him well, but most of what she knew was either never noted or not preserved. The preserved papers of Leather, Butterworth, Vaughan Williams and Lucy Broadwood contain the field notes and or written up copies of the various collectors' interactions with William. His 9 songs place him in joint 14th place for contributors of songs tunes to the first 4 volumes of the Journal of the Folk Song Society, equal with Emma Overd, so he made a significant contribution to early folk song collection. William's songs are an unremarkable collection. He gave 3 child ballads, all common in the tradition. In 2 cases, only the words for the first verse were recorded. He gave 11 broadside songs, mostly over 100 years old when collected, and he also gave 6 religious songs and carols. The balance of songs types is very similar to those in Andrew King's catalogue of Ella Leather's total collection. But here there are no music hall or minstrel songs, no drinking, hunting or comic songs, and certainly nothing bawdy. Strangely, for an agricultural labourer, there are no songs of farming life, such as All Jolly Fellows and its like. Religious songs are overrepresented compared to other collections. Ella Leather certainly selected the songs she wanted from the singer's repertoire. Her letter to Vaughan Williams of 1908, accompanying a cylinder recording, states, Colcombe learnt Tiresome Wife from an old man of 90 day before he died, insisted on me noting it. I feel doubtful about it. The words are horrid, and it was never published. There are 2 unusual items. Mountains High is an odd ballad in which a brother is persuaded not to kill his sister's suitor, which was only collected 6 times in the tradition. The Sinner's Dream is unique to Colcombe in the collected tradition and is frankly bizarre. Colcombe's preserved songs are exactly the sort that Edwardian collectors wanted. As I'm no musician, I am extremely grateful to Brian Peters, who gave me much help with this section of the talk. Translating a performance of a song from a skilled unaccompanied singer into music notation is a complex and subjective task, and different transcribers will achieve different results. In this case, although we don't have the original performance to compare with the transcript, we do have multiple collectors notating the same song and singer, albeit from different performances. We have 4 versions of Eggs in Her Basket survive. Annie Webb's transcription was subsequently published in the Journal of the Folk Song Society. Her manuscript copy has a note saying possible rhythm as if she was unsure, and certainly her handling of the rhythm seems clumsy in bars 2 and 7. The Butterworth Jekyll transcription includes a small section of text to indicate the word fit as if this was not clear. All 3 versions are in the Dorian mode, and the tunes are similar, but it looks as if all the transcribers had problems with Colcombe's rhythm, probably because he sang the song in an irregular manner. William's version with its cluster of triplets is unusual in transcriptions of traditional singers. The Butterworth Jekyll transcription feels a bit more natural. 4 versions of Brisk Young Sailor survive. The 2 tunes collected by Jekyll and Butterworth are practically identical, as might be expected, but their versions are significantly different from the other 2 in rhythm and melody. Annie Webb's version is the only one in the major scale, the others are in the Aeolian mode. Her musical background is unlikely to have included modal theory, whereas the others were well versed and enthusiastic hunters of such tunes. It is unlikely that the singer changed his tune after singing to Annie, so the difference here is likely to be due to the knowledge and expertise of the collector. Regarding the time significant differences, since Vaughan Williams seems to have agreed with Annie, we can guess that Colcombe's rhythm was ambiguous as it was in Basket of Eggs, and that the different collectors heard it differently. The Jekyll version of Lord Bateman has probably been preserved by Ella Leather, has probably been miscopied. She has put sharps instead of naturals in the Fs in bar 2 and 7 and ignored the F note in bar 6. The Jekyll version in Lucy Broadwood's archive shows natural Fs in bars 2 and 6 and a bracketed and tautologous sharp in the F note in bar 6, as if she wasn't sure about it. The joint transcription by Jekyll and Butterworth has an F natural in bar 2, a question mark over the F note in bar 6, and no F note at all in bar 7. It also uses a 3-2 time signature, whereas the others use 3-4. Webb's version is predominantly major. Webb's version has a predominantly major tonality, since the 7th in bar 2 is not flattened, although there is a flat 7th in bar 7. In several places, the melody is simplified or flattened out when compared to the others. Flattening the 7th note of the scale places the tune in mixolydian mode and would have been significant to people like Vaughan Williams and Butterworth, who were very keen on modal tunes. Recent analysis is less dogmatic, accepting that the notes of the scale that assign the tune to a given mode are often pitched ambiguously by traditional singers, as Colcombe appears to do in this case. Over half of Colcombe's songs have the complete set of words preserved in the collector's archives. These sets are mostly, of course, of the lesser known and religious songs. Against Francis Jekyll's transcription of Erin's Lovely Home is the comment, "Note words as ballad sheet." If the words for the songs had been published in the JFSS or street literature or were commonly collected, there was no need to preserve Colcombe's version. Of the 9 songs of Colcombe's that were printed in JFS, only 3 had complete sets of words. Colcombe's words for his unusual version of the Bitter Withy, which he called Sally Twigs, are not recorded, as they do not vary enough from other versions to be printed here. 3 of the 4 songs printed in Folklore of Herefordshire have complete sets of words. Ella Leather notes that Colcombe forgot words to his songs on occasion. Against the song Young Lankin, she notes that above text is imperfect, and the singer knew he had forgotten something in verse 2. Of the other 2, Moonshine's Bright was transcribed accurately, including grammatical inaccuracies, but The Brisk Young Sailor was not. The printed version has more dialect words than Jekyll's original notes, puck for picked, apern for apron, which may reflect Colcombe's actual dialect. However, his words, "but now my gown can scarcely pin," have been changed to, "but now a smile I canna win." Of the 105 cylinders preserved by the EFDSS and subsequently by the British Library, only 31 are recordings of English singers. Most have cracked or were damaged by mould. Andrew King derives a provisional total of 41 phonograph cylinders recorded by Ella Leather. Of these, 4 survive in the British Sound Library archive and are available for listening online. Andrew King's catalogue also indicates that at least 2 of Colcombe's songs were recorded by Ella Leather and sent to Vaughan Williams for transcription, but neither recording survives. The carelessness with which the cylinders were treated implies they had no archival value to their recordists. Once a fair notation had been made, they were discarded or left to decay. Vic Gammon notes that the eccentric and far-sighted Granger even had gramophone records made of a traditional singer, but it would be many years before the next. The early volumes of the JFSS are very dry stuff. Most of the text consists of comparisons of the tunes with those of other versions and other songs, as in these examples of William Colcombe's songs shown here. Illuminating as this was to the specialist, there is so much more that could have been said about the songs and the singers. Unfortunately, the collectors who knew and worked with William Colcombe did not keep their own notes or diaries, so what they knew of him was neither published nor preserved and is now lost. I earlier called the Folklore of Herefordshire magnificent, and so it is, except to my mind the chapter on folk song. There are 3 excellent essays by Ella Leather on Herefordshire folk song and singers. The introductory 4 paragraphs of this chapter, her introduction to the carols from Herefordshire in the JFSS, and collecting folk melodies from gypsies in Herefordshire in the Journal of the Gypsy Law Society. These are very human texts with a wealth of information on the singers, their songs, and the context in which they sang them. However, the remaining 29 pages of this chapter in the book revert to the academic comparison and analysis typical of the journal, in some cases repeating journal articles word for word. Given that the likely readership for the book was non-specialist, this would have been an ideal opportunity to tell more about the singers and their world and less about the academic interests of a specialist group. None of the early collectors, not one, was a skilled unaccompanied singer of folk songs. Not until Seamus Ennis and Bob Copper, armed at last with adequate recording equipment, began collecting for the BBC in the 1950s, did technology and real understanding of the songs from within combine. The collectors who met Colcomb were mostly accomplished musicians. Two, indeed, were internationally famous composers. For them, performance originated in the score and was encapsulated by the score. In order for them to understand and discuss folk song, it was necessary for them to reduce the performance to the bare bones of the tune. As Kidson said, it was the business of the folk song collector not to make a hard and fast record of one rendering of a folk tune with all its accidental inaccuracies, but to obtain what the singer obviously means. And with the honourable exception of Granger, this is what the collectors did. Clearly, variation in folk tunes could only be accidental. Once the collector had their sanitised tune, they had achieved their goal and they had saved their folk song. This is a reductionist process, having its uses, but in the end, similar to reducing a work of art to a very simple sketch, and the singer's performance to something like a pianola roll. Graham Freeman notes, collectors were often made the idea of a song as a sort of fetish, so much so that they not only ironed out any inconsistencies between the performance and their idealized version of the tune, but they also forgot to record names and vital information about the performers themselves. The song was an object, a complete thing unto itself, which admitted little, if any, influence from any elements of its rendering in performance. And all of these failings could be ascribed to the collectors in this study. But we cannot blame the folk song collectors for not being what we want them to have been. What we have as the result of the work of these 6 collectors is a bare bones notation of 20 songs, 3 stories, a brief description of the man, and 1 photograph. Opportunities were missed, but at least we have something of him and his songs. Many of his childless contemporaries would have left no record of their existence other than the census. Granger noted the cruel treatment meted out to folk singers as human beings. Most of them died in the poorhouses or other downheartening circumstances, and the thought of how their high gifts oftenest were allowed to perish unheard, unrecorded, and unhonoured. It cannot be said that this was true of these collectors and this singer. Certainly William Colcomb died in the poorhouse, but his songs were heard, recorded, and honoured in publication. Song collectors have sometimes been represented as exploiters of the rural working class, interested only in their songs, disinterested, even dismissive of them. Most were not. Ella Leather certainly was not. I shall finish by suggesting that the end of his long, hard and lonely life of poverty and years in the workhouse, William Colcomb's association with Ella Leather, Annie Webb and the others probably brought him a great deal of satisfaction and pleasure. Thank you for listening. Where's me stop share bit?
Thank you, Richard. Yes, please stop share. I'm afraid we are running out of time, unless somebody's got a burning question. That was excellent, and it's really interesting to see one singer.
Thank you.
It worries me a bit that the tunes, I mean, Vic can comment on this briefly, but, you know, it worries me that the different collectors have have noted different versions of the tune, and as a non-musician, that worries me.
Yes, it worried me too.
Sorry, carry on, Richard.
That's why I asked Brian for help on it, and it really is fascinating. And there's quite a few more examples in Ella Leather's collections where the collectors have transcribed the same song.
Yeah, but we presume, I mean, it's quite rare that we've got 4 collectors, you know, the same song. Presumably, as Vaughan Williams was working from a phonograph, and he was a talented musician, as far as we know, well, annotator, we presume that he's more trustworthy than the others. I don't know.
It's a debate to be had, I think.
Yeah. Vic's got his hand up. Vic?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd say 3 excellent presentations this afternoon on this. That is exactly what it's wonderful that you've got those transcriptions. That is exactly what I'd expect, that difference. Supposing 4 of us here decided to do a sketch of a church, would they all look the same? No, they wouldn't, because it's not an objective process. It's a subjective process. It depends on your skill, on your understanding, on your preconceptions, what you might hear. So that, and I'm afraid that our notated folk song collections are like this. They are not accurate guides to what went on. They are rough guides to what was sung, even with the best musicians. So, I mean, it's enormously interesting that you've turned this up, Richard, because I think that's absolutely fabulous. That is just what I would have expected from sort of looking at this stuff before. The stuff about the variable intervals, he may, you know, there are weak intervals of the scale. Singers sing them sometimes sharp. I mean, Brian is absolutely right there. Particularly the third and the seventh of the scale, assuming you can assume what the keynote is, that's not always easy. But they are quite variable. I mean, it's the blues third. It's there in all sorts of traditional music, and I think that's right. The last thing I would say is the just on the Sinner's Dream, which is very interesting. I do think those religious songs are interesting, and what I quickly looked on my iPad, and it appears on a broadsheet by Bloomer of Birmingham. It looks like mid-19th century to me, but one area to look at, and this is only an idea, is that in the early years of the 19th century, the what was it called? The Cheap Repository Tracks, Hannah More and her organisation purposely parodied popular ballads and popular songs to give them religious messages.
Oh, right.
And one of the good examples in the Hammond collection, I think it is the Ploughboy's Dream, is exactly one of those, but it's got into tradition. So I think, you know, I don't know, but it looks to me as if this might be something that comes in that sort of way. But of course, we shouldn't forget that a lot of people in England in the 19th century sang nothing else but religious songs. And you know, our concept of tradition is shaped by the collectors in all sorts of ways. And there is a strong tradition of families who would have nothing else, particularly those with a Calvinistic bent, who would have nothing else but religious songs to sing, and they probably sing them on Sunday nights. You know, enough. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Richard, and indeed to all three of our presenters today. Particularly strong meeting, I think. Round of applause for our people. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back in September. Don't forget the conference in July, and see some of you at Whitby. And thank you all for coming. Cheerio.